Welcome to The Explainer. Now, if you reach into your wallet right now and pull out a $50 bill, you're going to see a very familiar face, Ulysses S. Grant. Most of us probably recognize him as the guy who led the Union Army to victory in the Civil War and, eventually became our 18th president. But here's the thing. Despite having his face printed on our money, his actual legacy has been deeply misunderstood. It's been totally obscured by decades of rumors and historical revisions. So today, we're going to look past all those myths and uncover the true story of a man whose life was defined by just incredible soaring highs and absolutely devastating falls.
Okay, let's just dive right into the big question here. Was Ulysses S. Grant really our worst president? For a long time in the 20th century, if you looked at historical polls and surveys, Grant's reputation was just dismal. He was constantly painted as a drunk, a butcher on the battlefield, and honestly, a terrible, corrupt president. But recent historical analysis has started to drastically reevaluate his life and his leadership. And as we'll see as we go through this material, that old negative impression, it's largely unfair. To really get why, we need to go all the way back to the beginning.
Which brings us to Chapter 1, The Reluctant Soldier.
Born Hiram Ulysses Grant back in 1822 in a rural Ohio farming community, he was actually kind of foisted into the military by his father, who was a tanner and a really staunch abolitionist. A random registration error at West Point in 1839 forever changed his name to Ulysses S. Grant, and from there, his early adulthood was just a complete story of whiplash. He was a totally average student, graduating 21st out of a class of 39. Then, fast forward to 1846, he gets his very first taste of active combat in the U.S.-Mexican War under General Winfield Scott. He actually earns commendations and gets some vital experience there. But then, by the 1850s, he's stationed way out west in California, thousands of miles from his wife Julia and his kids. He falls into a severe depression and starts drinking. This causes some major friction with his commanding officers, ultimately leading him to resign in 1854. Fast forward just 4 years to 1858, he's back in St. Louis and his business ventures have completely tanked. Think about that. A guy who was a respected military officer just a few years prior is now literally reduced to selling firewood on a street corner just to survive. He even had to pawn his prized gold watch. It is a really staggering fall from grace.
That brings us to Chapter 2, The Unconditional Victor.
F. Scott Fitzgerald famously said, "There are no second acts in American life." Well, Grant's life completely blows that theory out of the water. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 acted as this ultimate catalyst, pulling this struggling civilian right back into uniform. By 1862, he's commanding a force of 25,000 men and besieges Fort Donelson in Tennessee. The Confederate commander actually reached out to ask what terms he'd be offered for surrender, and Grant fired back with this absolute legendary quote, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." And boom, he captured 15,000 troops. That single daring response completely catapulted his reputation overnight. He wasn't just some general anymore. To the public, he became Unconditional Surrender Grant.
Now, of course, as his fame grew, so did the noise from his critics. And we really need to take a neutral look at those famous rumors about his alcoholism. Was he this hopeless drunk? Well, the sources point to him being a binge drinker. That's an individual prone to bouts of really heavy alcohol consumption, which is then often followed by long periods of total abstinence. So while we can pretty much dismiss those cartoonish legends of him keeping a whiskey barrel right outside his command tent, it is true that he had bouts of heavy drinking. However, the most historically accurate picture suggests that he purposefully abstained for really considerable periods, especially when crucial military duties and campaigns were on the horizon. Basically, he never let the bottle interfere with his strategic brilliance.
And it was exactly this clear-headed military ethos that ultimately won the war. I mean, his rise was just meteoric. In 1863, he captures the heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, which secures the Mississippi River and literally slices the entire Confederacy in two. A year later, in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln recognizes this completely unmatched capability, promotes him to lieutenant general, and puts him in overall command of the entire Union Army. Grant then uses his overwhelming numerical superiority to just grind down the opposition. Finally, in April 1865, he accepts General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. But I really want you to notice that last point. Rather than seeking vengeance, Grant offered surprisingly lenient, compassionate peace terms with very few reprisals. His goal was to immediately start healing this deeply shattered nation.
And that massive goal of healing leads us right into Chapter 3, Reconstructing a Fractured Nation.
Following the absolutely tragic assassination of Lincoln and the incredibly turbulent presidency of Andrew Johnson, Grant stepped into the political arena. He ended up winning the 1868 presidential election using a very simple four-word slogan, "Let us have peace." But man, the America he inherited was severely traumatized and deeply, deeply fractured. What he actually accomplished while in office, though, is fascinating. Within just 2 weeks of taking the oath, he signed laws guaranteeing equal rights for African Americans. He heavily pressured the former Confederate states to ratify the 15th Amendment to secure voting rights for Black Americans. And when violent white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League rose up to spread terror across the South, Grant absolutely did not back down. He actually created the U.S. Justice Department specifically to crack down on these groups, and he deployed the federal army to maintain order. Because of this, his administration successfully dismantled the Ku Klux Klan for an entire generation.
But we also have to acknowledge that his time in office was marked by some really deep complexities, particularly when we look at Native American policy. On one hand, Grant was pretty enlightened for his era. He favored a policy known as benign assimilation, and he actually made history by appointing Eli S. Parker, a Seneca Indian, as his commissioner for Indian affairs. But you have to contrast that progressive intent with the really harsh reality happening on the ground. Relentless Western expansion and the discovery of gold in the Black Hills made conflict practically inevitable. This all tragically culminated in the Great Sioux War of 1876, which ended with Native Americans being forcibly moved onto reservations and completely stripped of their ancestral lands. It was a deeply depressing end to a policy that really did start with progressive intentions.
Let's move along to Chapter 4, Scandals and Statesmanship.
So Grant easily won a second term in 1872, but it was fraught with just immense difficulties, including the global economic panic of 1873, along with some really deep political controversies. A stark paradox pretty much defined his entire administration. The president himself remained scrupulously honest. He was completely unimplicated in any direct fraud. But he was perhaps a little too trusting of his inner circle. His associates, on the other hand, siphoned massive railway profits in what became known as the Credit Mobilius scandal. Later on, there was the whiskey ring, where federal officials were basically defrauding the government out of tax revenues. Now, Grant wasn't involved in this at all, but his private secretary and a secretary of war absolutely were. These actions by the people around him forced multiple cabinet resignations and unfortunately severely tarnished his political legacy.
And then, the final act of his presidency was pretty much a constitutional nightmare. The 1876 election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden resulted in highly disputed electoral votes across 4 different states. The entire nation was teetering on the brink of violence once again. But remaining incredibly calm, Grant refused to mobilize the army to dictate the result. Instead, he formed an electoral commission to decide the outcome peacefully. This whole situation ultimately led to the Compromise of 1877. Hayes wins the presidency, which thankfully averts a second civil war, but the political price of this compromise was just enormous. Federal troops were removed from the South, and this tragically cleared the way for the imposition of harsh Jim Crow laws, pretty much undoing so much of the Reconstruction progress that Grant had fought so hard for.
Which brings us to Chapter 5, the final victory.
After leaving office at just 54 years old, Grant embarked on this triumphant 2.5-year world tour. We're talking meeting Queen Victoria, Otto von Bismarck, the Emperor of Japan, the whole shebang. But true to the absolute roller coaster nature of his life, this massive high was almost immediately followed by total ruin. He got involved in an investment with a Wall Street conman named Ferdinand Ward, which turned out to be a massive pyramid scheme, leaving the former president completely entirely bankrupt. And as if that wasn't enough, he was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer shortly after. Grant desperately needed a way to provide for his family after he was gone, so he decided to write his personal memoirs. Hearing about his terrible situation, the legendary author Mark Twain stepped in to be his publisher, and he offered Grant a staggering 70% royalty rate on book sales. It was a clear act of charity, but also a sign of profound respect for the ailing general.
And wow, did that generous rate lead to an incredible financial return, $500,000. Racing against his advancing cancer in what had to be excruciating pain, Grant finished his memoirs just days before he passed away on July 23, 1885. The book was a massive, instant bestseller. It generated nearly $500,000 in royalties, which was an absolute fortune in the late 19th century. This secured his wife Julia's financial future exactly as he had hoped. He won his final battle.
So, here we are at our final slide. And we're left with the ultimate question: general, president, or survivor? Exactly how will history remember Ulysses S. Grant?
I mean, from a guy selling firewood on a street corner to the grand architect of the Union victory, from a president who literally crushed the Ku Klux Klan to a trusting leader who was betrayed by his closest friends, and finally to a dying man penning a literary masterpiece just to save his family from ruin. Grant's life was this endless series of remarkable resurrections. So the next time you look at that $50 bill, ask yourself, is this really the face of a failed politician, or is it the face of one of history's most resilient, complex, and misunderstood heroes? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.